business journalism is about following the money.
Jason Kelly, chief correspondent at Bloomberg Originals.
Alex Rodriguez, 14-time All-Star and World Series champion.
This is the deal.
I feel very fortunate to work alongside Alex. He's a great partner. The stories that are most compelling to me are the ones where people are pushing a new idea or a new investment or a new market. When we interviewed Serena Williams, we were talking about her first deal. She changed the narrative, not just who she was, but what the sport could be. Every story is a business story.
Jason Kelly, welcome to Post Run High.
I'm so happy to be here. Great run.
Great run. I am so excited for you to be here with me. So for context, guys, Jason and I just ran a little bit over 2 miles through Brooklyn. I loved finding out that you're a runner. When I asked you to be on the show, I had no idea that you had such a running background.
I love running so much.
Let's talk about it.
I sort of fell into it, I guess as many people do, as a bit of an alternative. I was a kid. I was going to high school in Texas, which I spent my growing up years sort of between Atlanta and Houston. I was going to high school in Houston, Texas, St. Thomas High School. And, the natural thing is like, you're going out for the football team. My dad had played high school football, back in Atlanta. And I spent 2 weeks doing it and I hated it. But I also knew just sort of the way I was raised, like you should do a sport. And the only other sport that was available was cross country. And so I did it. And that really started, my love affair with running. And I ran all through high school, ran cross country and track, and I was fine. And then I went to college and sort of like did the opposite of running. I was basically like sitting and working at the newspaper. And then I got out of college, and one of my very best friends to this day, a guy named Billy Robbins, ran a marathon. My wife and I went to watch him with his wife. And I was like, I could do that. Like I could run a marathon. And literally like 6 months later, he and I ran a marathon together, and I went on to run probably a dozen marathons, and it really became part of my identity. I think, especially when I was in my like 20s and 30s, it was really something I identified myself as, and I loved the community of it. I loved the ability. I mean, you have a whole show based on this. The way you can get to know someone on a run in a way that you don't if you're having a meal or having a drink or in a meeting. There's an intimacy to it. And I think you can't sort of help but be authentic. It's sort of like I have 2 kids who are college age, and I'm the like millionth parent to say this, but the best conversations you have with your kids is when you're driving in the car, because you're not looking at each other, you're sort of looking ahead. And that's sort of like with a run. Like I've sort of said things and heard things on a run that I don't think I would necessarily say face to face.
It's amazing how you can foster such good conversation through shared activity. Yeah. And it's funny that you said the car reference, because one of the initial inspos for the running interview show that we just did was carpool karaoke.
Yeah.
And I always loved watching that growing up. And when we had the idea for the running interview show, I was like, there's kind of some synergy here between carpool karaoke and not being face to face, but kind of running side by side or sitting side by side.
Well, can I tell you another thing that like interviewer to interviewer? One of our little tricks that we use, especially when we make our documentaries in Bloomberg Originals, I host a show called Power Players in addition to The Deal. And almost always we try and get someone in a car and we get them to drive. And actually, the very first time I met, or not the first time I met him, but the first really meaningful thing that I did with Alex Rodriguez was an episode of this series we did called Athlete Empire. And one of the things we did is we drove from his house to his high school, and we put cameras in the car, and we were both mic'd up, and he told me just some incredible stories about what it felt like to be drafted. He talked about his suspension, he talked about like real stuff. And I'm convinced it's because when you're doing something else, your guard's a little bit down. And so you're a little more willing to kind of go there.
Especially when you're doing such a familiar activity.
Yes.
Like there's something about running, especially if you were a cross country runner growing up, that almost brings you back in a way
Yes.
to those years where, you're running with a group of friends and, you're becoming friends with people that maybe you weren't friends with outside of the cross country team, and just like connects you in a whole new way.
Totally. I love it. I mean, and it's really, it's a way to really get to know someone.
Well, running with you through Brooklyn was so fun. I just have to say, you have such an impressive career. And when I found out that you were down to do the show, I was so excited.
Thank you.
I found out about you through watching your Paul Rabel episode on the deal with A-Rod. And ever since watching that episode, I found myself going down a wormhole and just being so fascinated by your work and
Thank you.
everything you do, especially in relation to business and sports business. Before we get into everything you're up to now, I want us to rewind and just for everybody to learn your journey and hear how all of this came to be.
Yeah. I mean, I've thought a lot about like how I ended up being where I am, and the person I give the most credit to is my mom. When I was 5 years old, she signed me up for a creative writing class, and I don't think I could probably barely write, but I could think about stories, and that's when I decided I wanted to be a writer. I didn't know what that exactly was going to entail. I was a bit of a corporate brat growing up. My dad had a bunch of different jobs, and he went to work for Procter and Gamble right out of undergrad. I was born when my parents were really young, and so I sort of like grew up with them in a lot of ways.
How old were your parents when they had you?
My dad was 20 and my mom was 19. And they were high school sweethearts. And so here I was. And it was a really fun childhood because my dad finished college while I was a kid. He went to Georgia Tech, and then he went to work for Procter and Gamble in a little town called Jackson, Tennessee. And my brother was born there. And then my dad had this really interesting moment in his own life and career where he had been trained as an engineer, and he got interested in business, and he applied to 2 business schools, University of Memphis, which was half an hour away, and Harvard Business School. And he got into both. And the way he tells the story, I shouldn't tell his story, but I will, because it's sort of our story. His late dad said to him, he's like, whatever you need to do, however, we can't help you with money, but we'll help you however we can. You need to go to Boston. And that like obviously changed the trajectory of his career. And so we lived in Boston for a couple of years. My parents, my brother and I. My mom, who's very Southern, would tell you we were poor as church mice. And then we moved back to Atlanta. My dad went to work for Coca-Cola. And so I sort of grew up in that milieu. And I do think watching him through his career made me interested in business. I sort of had this front row seat to one of the most dynamic companies in the world, and, being the kid of an executive there. But all the time I was thinking, I'm going to be a writer, I'm going to be a journalist. And I worked in the high school newspaper. I went to Georgetown. I worked for one of the newspapers on campus there. And I really thought I was going to be a political reporter. And then I got a chance to go back to Atlanta after college to cover the Olympics. And I was so excited to be home. My now wife, who I had met in college, was going to business school down there. And I got a job at the business newspaper in Atlanta. And I realized politics was interesting. Business was more interesting. And there were just these big personalities. And that as I looked around, and this has been a theme through my career, every story is a business story, whether we're talking about running, or we're talking about Wall Street, or we're talking about potato chips. Like everything comes back to business.
I think that's what's so fascinating about your podcast, The Deal, is you're talking to these incredible athletes and coaches and people in the world of sports.
Yeah.
And it does all fall back to business. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about Bloomberg and the work that you guys do, and through the context of all these different industries that you cover. What would you say are the components that make a great journalist?
Curiosity is absolutely the first. I think being interested in other people, in wanting to understand their stories. And I think being willing and eager to be a translator and to be an explainer. One of the things that attracted me to business journalism specifically was it felt like there was a barrier to entry in terms of it's like, oh, this is complicated and it's business and it's numbers and things like that. I was an English major and a theology minor. Like I have no business training whatsoever. I've gotten a ton of training at Bloomberg and Bloomberg when I joined in 2002, like we literally had a month-long boot camp where I learned all about balance sheets and income statements and the Bloomberg terminal and all of those great things. But being able to distill those issues down in a way that, lots of people can understand is, I mean, what an amazing opportunity to be able to do that. And I think it's a language that, we can help other people speak. And so I think that's one component of being a journalist. And, the curiosity piece is, I think, obvious. I also think, as much as I am currently talking, I think one of the greatest skills as a journalist is to listen. And I think as an interviewer, and you're so excellent at it, part of what is a very powerful thing that I've discovered as I've tried to become a better and better interviewer is listening to what the person is saying and maybe even some of what they're not saying, and to think about, if you're the audience, what would you want to know next, and just to sort of go with that. And oftentimes, and Alex and I talk about this a lot when we're prepping for our podcast, which do a lot of prep, but so much of it is about just knowing the information, but being willing to just let it flow.
When you are a journalist, I think the thing that's so interesting is you get to talk to so many people and learn so much through them about what they do. And you almost become like a subject matter expert through just having conversation. And
Yeah.
I love that you said curiosity. And on one of our recent episodes, as we were talking about this before we started filming, but I sat down with Alex Lieberman, who's the founder of Morning Brew,
Yeah.
and we were talking about curiosity. And he was explaining to me how he thinks about curiosity as a muscle. And he thinks that there's ways that you can work the muscle of being curious.
Wow.
And so I'm curious about you. Is there anything that you do that you think helps you stay curious? How do you work your muscle of curiosity?
Wow, that's a really good question.
I can give you an example of what he does. And I
Yes.
thought it was so interesting.
Okay,
So he was
please.
saying the way he works this muscle is he'll go outside and he'll say, oh, there's a train. How does that train work? I wonder who's on the train right now. I wonder what they
Yeah.
do for work. Or this cup, like, why is it designed like this? What's the importance of the swivels? Or,
Right.
anyway, so he's just kind of like looking at all the things around him and thinking to himself kind of how everything works.
Yeah. I like that. I mean, I think, I spend so much of my time thinking about people, and I have a great editor I've worked with at Bloomberg who said to me as we were developing some of our series a few years ago, especially around sports, he said, I want you to create shows where you understand what makes people tick, but never ever use the term what makes people tick. And I think a lot about that, but I also think about this notion of finding common ground with people, like being curious about who they are and then looking for ways that you can connect with them. And maybe it's, you and I have a commonality around the sport of lacrosse, and so that like your brothers played, my son played, I never played, and yet I know a lot about it, and I'm very curious actually about lacrosse. But when you find those things, like those are the moments where, candidly, when you're interviewing someone, you need to get them to trust you. And part of what I think we try and do in the deal is to take people into subject areas where they're comfortable, but they haven't thought about it as much. And so when we interviewed Serena Williams, I remember this moment, if I can be a little bit meta, where we had the benefit of like a ton of research. We have an incredible team who works with us. I had done a lot of reading. I'd obviously followed Serena's career very closely. Alex knows her really well. And we were talking about her first deal. We talk about people's deals. And her first endorsement was with Puma. And I had read in her book, in a book, I believe a book about her description of being at the table, literally falling asleep at the table during this negotiation for her first deal. And I brought it up and I said, and I think you fell asleep at the table. And she looked at me and she goes, no. I passed out. She's like, I was so tired. But there was this, if you watch the show, there's a moment where I feel like her body language changes and she looks at me as if to say, oh, this guy did the work. Like he knows what he's talking about. Like, I'm comfortable now. Like I'm going to engage in this conversation in a way that I might not otherwise have because they're in it with me. And I think, so the depth of curiosity, I think, is interesting too. And your willingness to, really understand your subject matter as much as you can, and then be open to wherever they want to go.
And I feel like Serena Williams is such a good example of somebody you're so naturally curious about, especially if you're somebody that's followed her career, which I feel like so many of us have, even if we haven't followed it so closely.
And yet there's this whole element, this whole side of her that I feel like, and this was the huge opportunity that I feel like we had with our show and we continue to have with our show, which is, people like Serena, people like Michael Strahan, people like Magic Johnson. I mean, they are unbelievable business people. They have applied this playbook, this skill set that they created as athletes to this whole other thing, to unbelievable success. And so understanding how that translates is just fascinating to me.
And it's fascinating to sit down with the people that have translated it so well, because there's some people that don't, right? And it's so cool to see how some of these people have created incredible businesses and careers outside of the sport that they excelled at. If you're enjoying this episode, please do us a quick favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps more people discover these conversations and it helps us continue bringing on amazing guests for you. When you think about Bloomberg, you think about finance and data. And of course, we've said that business applies to so many different things. I know you've been at Bloomberg since 2002. When did you make the transition to focusing on sports? And I know you focus on a range of topics, but when did sports become something that you were really passionate about?
I mean, I can track it back to a very specific moment. It was the summer of 2020 and pretty recently, I had kept an eye on sports sort of in my peripheral vision, in part because I'd covered Wall Street for a long time. And one of the things that I was seeing was a lot of people that I had covered, private equity tycoons, in particular, buying sports teams and investing in sports. So that was sort of in my mind. I had seen, Josh Harris and Mark Lazary and Tony Ressler, people that I had covered, David Blitzer, people who I had covered as just private equity investors get into sports. And so, in the most basic way, business journalism is about following the money. That's just, like, at its core, like, that's what you do. And so that was on my mind. But the really catalytic moment was I wrote a cover story for Bloomberg Business Week and did a TV special about LeBron James and Maverick Carter and their creation of Spring Hill. And it came at this, unbelievably historic moment. The interview and the story just happened to be the first time that LeBron had spoken publicly about the murder of George Floyd, about Black Lives Matter, about COVID. He talked in that interview about the death of Kobe Bryant, all these things that had happened. And at the same time, he talked about this incredible business ambition that he and Maverick had and what they were building at Spring Hill, not just in the media company, but, his ambitions in business. And that just hit me as there is something really interesting happening here, because LeBron James is the most famous athlete in the world, or one of them, and has this ambition, and he's not alone, and he's following in the footsteps of Magic Johnson. He's following the footsteps to some extent of A-Rod. And so I had the great opportunity, with the backing of some senior editors at Bloomberg, to just go and start exploring what we describe as this intersection of business, sports, and culture. And I think the and culture piece was a really critical bit of it, because there were and are people who are covering sort of the transactions, and we do some of that as well. But I think what sports does, and I think you appreciate this as much as anyone, is it just hits so far above its weight in terms of cultural impact. If you think about, we're taping this just, a few days after the Knicks have lost in the playoffs. I mean, it was a moment in New York, whenever there's a big victory or a big loss, when the Yankees win the World Series, which they have not done in a long time, as Alex is paying to remind us. These are moments, and even, watching my son play college lacrosse, it's all of the sports just hits different. And I think that appreciation that something meaningful was happening both culturally, but then also the economics have just, exploded. And we sort of got lucky in the sense that it really took off from there.
And I want to tap into the culture topic as soon as we start talking about your podcast a little bit more in depth, because I noticed through listening to the deal that you guys do such a beautiful job of tying that in to kind of each of the athletes or people that you feature on the show. There are so many things that you can cover in the world of sports business.
Mm-hmm.
How do you decide as a journalist what to cover?
I try and think a lot about what's new and what's next. And we recently had Melody Hobson on our show. It's an unbelievable investor, co-CEO of Ariel Investments, has been just recently left the board of Starbucks, is on the board of JP Morgan. She's an icon in business. And one of the things that she said, which has really stuck with me, in fact, I mentioned it to somebody today, is this idea that she's created a fund solely to invest in women's sports. And the way she's framing it is women's sports is a growth stock. It's a great, and that's how they at Ariel are viewing it. And so those are the ones that are especially interesting to me, these, sort of high growth stories, a little bit of risk. I mean, I think women's sports is an absolutely fascinating area. We've been looking very closely at it for really 4 or 5 years. And I do think anticipated, I dare say, a lot of what has come in terms of the higher valuations and the big investments, the viewership, the sponsorship, everything that's going on there. So those are the stories that are super compelling to me. I think the other stories are really, and this is what we try and do through the deal and other venues, is understanding the why of, why this is a big opportunity, how a league came to be. We talked about Paul Rabel a little bit. What a cool story he has of deciding as a professional athlete that the best thing for his sport is to create an entirely new league. What? How does that, what's the process of that?
Well, I even liked listening to Paul Rabel and hearing him talk about how he's trying to make it a sport that's more easily available for people even in the inner city, you know, it's making it like a street basketball, but street lacrosse.
Yes. Yeah.
I loved hearing that part of it.
Yeah. And so I think the stories that are most compelling to me are the ones where people are pushing a new idea or a new investment or a new market or a new geography, creating a new league. League One volleyball is a really interesting one that we've covered a little bit. We covered on the deal, which is one of the first leagues where they have the youth all the way up to the professional within this one league. So those sorts of stories are the most compelling to me.
I've interviewed a lot of female athletes for the Running Interview Show, and from people from, Olympic runners to soccer players, basketball players. And the one thing, of course, that all of these professional women athletes are so passionate about is the future of women's sports.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, as somebody that has been doing a lot of research on it and kind of stays on the pulse of what's going on within the business of sports, where do you think women's sports are heading?
It is one of the questions, I think, in sports right now. The valuations are rising really fast. In the past year alone, you've had records just keep getting set in terms of franchise valuation. So Angel City, which is the women's soccer club in Los Angeles, changed hands. Willow Bay and Bob Iger bought that at a valuation of $250 million. That was a record. Well, then New York Liberty, which is owned by Claire Wu Tsai and Joe Tsai, just raised money at a $450 million valuation. So new record.
Based on those valuations, do you think social media has shifted the way women's
I love
teams are
that.
being marketed?
Yes, totally. I think that so much of what is happening with women's sports is absolutely fueled by social media, both in terms of the teams, but also in terms of the individual athletes. If you think about, obviously Caitlin Clark is sort of the uber example of all this, but you think about Juju Watkins at USC, you think about Haley Van Lith, you think about all of these athletes who have these massive social presences. Also, I think one thing we cannot overlook when it comes to women's sports is the benefit that the changes in name, image, and likeness, NIL, have had. Obviously, they've had a dramatic and profound effect on college football and men's college basketball, but they've had a similarly profound effect on women's college basketball, especially, Paige Beckers, who just came into the WNBA this season out of UConn, had a thriving and very profitable NIL portfolio. AZ Fudd, her teammate, who's still at UConn, her former teammate who's still at UConn, has millions of dollars in NIL. So I think that exposure, and then the other thing, I could go on and on about this, but
I love that you can go on and on about this, and I love knowing also that you only just started diving into sports in 2020.
Okay.
Yeah, you have such a
I love this stuff.
You have so much knowledge on sports as a whole.
It's so fun. And I do think, one of the things that is that is certainly true about women's sports specifically is the disruption across the media landscape has made it so much more possible for people to see things that they just didn't see before. And one of the things that we've really seen when it comes to women's sports, and there's a lot of data around this as well. There's a great group called Sports Innovation Lab out of Boston that's done some great work about the fluid fan and specifically around fans of women's sports, that it's demonstrated that when it is put on air, and we've seen this in the women's Final Four, people watch it.
Go UNC?
Yeah, it is unbelievable, and that translates to, women's basketball, college and pro, the NWSL, which is the, Professional Women's Soccer League, is seeing just bigger and bigger numbers. And so what needs to happen next is those deals need to keep happening so that people can see it and engage with the content.
Do you feel like there's a ripple effect of the NIL that we haven't seen just yet?
Yeah, we're at a really critical moment when it comes to NIL, I think, because inevitably, if you were to Google NIL and Wild Wild West, you would see a million searches come back because that's what everybody says it is, and it's not wrong. There is a settlement, not to get too technical about it, there's a settlement coming between the NCAA and the House of Representatives that is going to bring some measure of order to how college athletes are going to get paid and bring some guardrails to NIL. It does need to happen. I think the question, I hope, showing my personal view a little bit, I hope the question of whether we should pay college athletes has been asked and answered. I think we all should agree that yes, they should get paid in some form or fashion. The getting paid with a college education is a farce. And the amount of money that's being generated, especially for college football and college basketball, the amount of money that the schools, the coaches, et cetera, are getting on the backs of free labor, that's patently unfair. I do think there are more ripple effects. I don't know exactly. I don't think anybody knows exactly where it's going to go. I do think, though, that we will continue paying college athletes, and we should.
I agree. I mean, I feel so bad for the athletes that made it to college
I
on these
know.
big scholarships and then get injured. And it's like they didn't even have the opportunity to make a little bit of change
Right.
before not being able to go pro.
Totally. And the percentage of people who, really do make it
So small.
is infinitesimal. It's so small. So small. The reason that Livy Dunn and Paige Beckers and Juju Watkins and so many of the other athletes, female and male, are getting paid is because they deliver. People listen to them. They buy the products that they're selling. So, that I think it's really important to note that, State Farm and Ally, I mean, those are two companies that have invested heavily in women's sports. They're not doing it. That's not charitable. They're doing it because they can make money. And the big shift that's happened really, I think, in the past 3 to 5 years is, and just about anyone who's deeply involved in women's sports will tell you this, is that there was a massive shift of team owners and investors who went from being like, oh, this is really cool. Like, we're like supporting, like, go girls. Like, this is great, to like, I want to make some money. And fact of the matter is, and this is like Bloomberg guy speaking, it's like,
I love this.
when people make money, like, more people are going to pile in because they want to make money. And that's how businesses grow. And that's how women's sports is going to grow, is if people keep investing in it.
When you first started out as a journalist at Bloomberg, what did your role look like then, and kind of how has it evolved?
No, I'm glad you put it in that context, because I feel unbelievably fortunate to have had the career that I've had at Bloomberg. And, I came in 2002 in the Atlanta bureau, like covering big technology companies, writing about earnings and, writing off of press releases and trying to break news about Intel and Motorola and Texas Instruments and things like that. And, I do feel like my career at Bloomberg, where I've been, I make the joke that I've written everything from a tweet to a book. I've had the opportunity to write magazine cover stories for multiple magazines that we've had. I've hosted television shows, radio shows, original series. I was our New York bureau chief. I wrote 2 books. I ran our live events business. It is a company and a news organization that is deeply invested in innovation. This is a company that was founded in 1981 by Mike Bloomberg because he saw an opportunity to bring transparency to the bond market. And so that notion of like transparency, but also creating something new, like pervades everything that we do. And, I think it favors, and I would like to think I'm an example of this, it favors people who want to try new things. I've been very fortunate to be able to raise my hand and say, I want to try this. Like, I think there's something here, or even if it's like, I want to write a story, or I want to go to this place and report this out and see what's happening. I want to go interview this person. One of the things we think about, and I think the deal is a really interesting example of this, is that represents how we're thinking now, is we need to meet people where they are in terms of getting our good stuff to them. And so when it comes to the deal, it's one of the first times we really conceive something from the beginning as it's a video show, it's a TV show, it's a podcast, it's social, it's written, it's, distributed. However you want to get it, it's going to be there for you, maybe sometimes whether you want it or not. But, and listen, it took a lot of people sort of coming together to do that. But that was the idea, was, and we had never, to my knowledge, done a show where, we paired an external talent with an internal talent. I use that term loosely. A Bloomberg journalist and an outside expert to sort of create a show like this. And so I think it speaks to our willingness to like, let's try it.
What I'm really getting from that too, from you also as an individual, is it's so cool knowing how, as a journalist, you've been able to tap into all of these different mediums of storytelling.
Yeah.
You're not just a writer, like you're a host, you're a camera facing journalist. Did you ever think, like when you were writing for the newspaper back in college or high school, that you'd eventually be sitting next to A-Rod hosting a show with him on camera? Just speaks so much to being a curious person and being open to trying new things.
Well, thank you. I did not. I definitely did not. And I definitely have had some moments. I was flying off to do some interview for the deal. And my college age sons, we have a family, like every family should. We have a good family text chain. And I said, boys, I'm not going to be home. I'm going to be doing this. And they're like, what, who are you interviewing? And I think it was actually season 1. And we were going to LA, and I was interviewing. We had, in one day, we taped interviews with Maria Sharapova and Derek Jeter.
I just watched the Derek Jeter one. It was great.
Which was amazing. And it was an amazing conversation to see the two, to see Alex and Derek together. And I'm pretty sure one of my sons that day texted back, "This isn't a job." and I can see the point. Like it often doesn't seem like it. And it is really fun to get to talk to people like that. And honestly, I feel very fortunate to work alongside Alex. He's a great partner. We've gotten very close. And I think the best episodes are the ones where we really just, we're in a flow, we're teammates and we're partners.
First, I want to ask, how did this podcast come to be? And what is it like working alongside somebody like A-Rod?
Yeah. So I had done this series called Athlete Empire as part of Bloomberg Originals. And I had interviewed Alex during COVID for, we were all remote. We were doing these remote conferences. And he happened to be coming in a few months later. He happened to be coming into Bloomberg for an in-person interview, not with me, just for Bloomberg Television. And someone flagged that he was coming in, and I was like, "Oh, I'll go say hi to him." I don't remember. I think I'd met him once, like we'd shaken hands years before. And so I went into the makeup room actually, and he's like getting made up. And I was like, "Hey, I'm Jason." We talked, and he's like, "Hey man, how you doing?" And I sort of just pitched him in that moment. I said, I have this idea about a series on athletes and their business ambitions. I really, am intrigued by what you've done. I'd love to come spend a couple of days with you in Miami if you're game for it. And he said, pretty much on the spot, he said, yeah, that would be great. And he's like, and this is the way he is. He's like, he's thinking about it like, yeah, we could do this and I'll show you this thing and you could come to the office and all these different things. So we did that. And then we just kept in touch. He has an amazing chief business officer named Kelly LaFerriere, and she lives up here in the Northeast. And so she and I would get together, like every few months, just have lunch. And about 3 years ago, she called and said, Alex and I have some ideas about, how you and he could work together. You're going to be in Miami at all? And I happen to be going down for a speaking engagement. And so we had lunch, and we started, it was as he was getting into his ownership, then minority ownership of the Minnesota Timberwolves and Lynx. And so we got into we basically just like sit down and we're just like going. We're just talking about like, oh, and this thing, and what do you think about this? And he's asking me like, what have I seen with other ownership groups? And we're just like rapping. And he's like, we should work together. And I said, well, maybe we could do a show. We could do a podcast. And he said, well, but what would the show be? And I remember saying, I was like, well, not to be too like Seinfeld about it, but like, this is the show. Like, this is the show. Like, it's us talking, and, we'd bring people in that we know and talk to them about the, sort of their business ambitions. Like, and you would, be able to weigh in with your experience, and, I'm the journalist in the room, et cetera. And he basically said, I love it. Go back to New York, see what everybody thinks. And I did. And like a few months later, we were off and running, which again, like sort of speaks to Bloomberg's, willingness to be like, yeah, this sounds like a good idea and we trust you and let's see how it goes. One of the funniest things was I think we literally went through like 250 names for this. Like we couldn't come up with something for the show. And, they're like bad puns related to baseball and then stuff that just like didn't really capture it. And but we kept sort of coming back to this idea of the deal. And finally there was a text exchange where I think it was Kelly said, I'm here with Alex. He wants to know what do you want? And what do you like the most? And I said, I really like the deal. And he's like, I do too, done. And what's funny about that is I don't think we realized at the time how much of a nice framework the name gave us, because as you well know, as a fellow podcaster, a lot of podcasts out there.
A lot of deals.
And a lot of deals. But we wanted something that would immediately say to people, both the guests and the listeners and the viewers, this is going to be a little bit different. If we're talking to Michael Strahan, we're not talking about, we may talk a little bit about football, but we're really going to talk about him as a businessman, and if we're talking to, Josh Harris, the owner of the Washington Commanders and the Philadelphia 76ers and more, but we're going to talk about deals. We're going to talk, and on that episode, we talked about the deal to, build this unbelievable new stadium in Washington and sort of what it took to get that. And so it gives us this kind of home base in a way to sort of build the conversation around it.
That's how it feels when you're listening and you're going to learn about a very niche topic about this person.
And a specific thing.
Yeah, that you really don't get to hear about in other interviews. Out of all of the athletes you guys have been able to interview on your show, who would you say is the most business savvy?
I mean, A-Rod is definitely up there. I would say it's hard to choose. Strahan blew me away. I think his approach, it was interesting. So we essentially did sort of back-to-back episodes around him or sort of involving him, because we taped an episode with him, and then he has a partner named Constance Schwartz-Marini, who they created this company called Smack together. And she really had such a strong hand in making him who he is. She's also the chief advisor to Coach Prime. I mean, she's a force, and it's one of my all-time favorite episodes, and it's actually one of our best performing episodes as well. Cons is. Michael's ambition and his understanding of how he could use the platform that he had, not just as an athlete, but as an athlete in New York, I think was so smart and so compelling. And he is also such a nice and genuine human being. And so I think I really was impressed by his depth of understanding, his willingness to work hard, very holistically. So he is definitely he's definitely someone that I hold in high esteem on that.
Yeah, and I like that you said his ability to work hard, because I feel like that's, and I mean, you guys know more than anybody, but I feel like that grit level is such a common thread that you hear about that athletes have. And even when I was talking to John Gray, I was asking him, who do you guys look for in a new hire at Blackstone? And one of the examples that he gave is, he said, I love hiring athletes because they do what it takes. And
totally,
it's cool knowing that your son's a college lacrosse player, because I know from experience with my brothers, it was such a good mark on the resume to have that team experience, that background, because companies do love hiring athletes. And
I will tell you the thing that so I'll take the first question in a slightly different direction, which is, I think one attribute, even beyond working hard, discipline, goal setting, all of that I admire and appreciate so much, and I appreciate it every day with Alex, is coachability. And I think the the ability to take feedback constructively is an absolute superpower. And I see it with my son and his teammates. And I do think one of the reasons that, there is a very high percentage of athletes who get to the C-suite is because they have a lot of those skills. And I do think feedback is one of them. And you think about it, it totally makes sense in that, I've watched my son do this where he's on the field, he makes a mistake, he comes off, coach gets in his face, says, don't do this again. And then he can't go sit on the bench and cry. He literally has to go back out on the field and take that in and learn from it immediately and then move on and sort of internalize it and pack it away and do it right the next time. If you think about, and Alex talks about this all the time, the number of times he struck out. And then probably 20 minutes later, he's got to go up and do it again. And he's got to figure out, okay, what did the pitcher do last time? What do I learn from that? What are my teammates telling me? What is my hitting coach saying? What is my manager saying? You bobble a ball, the next pitch is coming. You got to go. And that is an unbelievably valuable skill in life.
Absolutely. Having that adaptability is so important.
Totally.
In your conversation with Serena, I found it so interesting when she was saying that the advice her dad gave her when she was younger was telling her that you're not going to make the most of your money on the court. You're going to make it off the court. And I loved hearing about her first deal with Puma and how there was something about a cat suit and this whole kind of cultural phenomenon of what she was wearing on the court and how that catapulted her into almost like a different stratosphere of a player. So on that note, I would love it if we could dive into cultural capital and its impact on business.
I think if I had to TLDR it, what I would say is she knew that she was doing something important when she wore if you Google Serena Williams and catsuit, you'll see a million pictures of it. I think what she realized and what's such an amazing lesson is the cultural impact that sports and our top athletes have on the broader world and how much they influence what we wear, what we buy, what we think. And so that moment where she essentially was her authentic self, she changed the narrative about not just who she was, but what the sport could be, what sport could be, in the broader conversation, and just the profound influence that, people can have by the choices they make. And, I think we love sports for those reasons because it does, as I was saying earlier, it hits bigger, it hits different. There's an emotion to it. There's a connection that we have, to our teams. I grew up down south, and the deep emotional connection that people have to their college football teams. The only thing that I think is comparable is English football. That the tribalism, the deep generational connection to these teams, this notion that your very being sort of rises and falls on the performance of this club or this team is just amazing. And some of that is unhealthy at times, but it's also, what an amazing connection to have. It's I went to Georgetown 30 years ago. I still rise and fall on Georgetown basketball, fall mostly these days, but sadly. But, I think about those iconic athletes. I think about, again, with that experience, I think about how culturally relevant. Think about the impact that Allen Iverson had as a player on the culture, on fashion. LeBron James isn't LeBron James without Allen Iverson, and, even the coaches that we see now, not to put too much stock in my alma mater, but it's John Thompson like completely changed the narrative about like who a coach should be, how he should treat his players, what players should expect, what a school should expect from a coach. I mean, sports is just, I mean, this is why I do feel so passionately about what we do, is because sports allows us to connect in a way that almost nothing else does.
Part of what you just said leads me to your book, Sweat Equity. You wrote an entire book on the booming fitness industry for recreational athletes.
Yeah.
Can you talk to us a little bit about what inspired the book?
Yeah. I mean, what's funny is it really, it was encapsulated like in our run together, that my inspiration for that book was exactly what I was living in the exact sense that you and I were running through Brooklyn, of this connection with another human being, this association with being healthy and thinking about my mind and my body. And then, of course, the business journalist kicks in. And then it's a question of like, oh, by the way, I'm also spending a ton of money on this. Like, whether it's like to go run a race, whether it's to go to a Peloton class, whether it's to go to Barry's boot camp, whether it's to, buy Roan or Lululemon or whatever that may be. And so the main conceit of that book, which I think holds true, although I would obviously,
No, I think the
10
book
years
holds
on,
true even more so.
maybe so.
It's becoming more and more relevant.
Right. I mean, I would obviously write it with different examples today, or a few different examples. Although some, like Lululemon has endured, obviously, Barry's Boot Camp has endured. There are some things like Color Run that, you're like, oh yeah, Color Run. Okay, Tough Mudder. Like that, yeah. I mean, people do them in a way.
Those were such a moment.
Such
I mean,
a
those were
moment.
like the beginning of fitness becoming this thing that people identify with
Yes.
versus just being like a part of their lifestyle.
Exactly. Yeah. And that was, and I do think, and that was really the, like, if there's as they say in the TV business, like if there was a log line, that was it. It was like how, exercise moved from like something we did to who we are. And part of it was even just the way we, the way we dress, the idea that, men and women were, going grocery shopping in like their Lululemon leggings, or, showing up and talking about their workouts and all of those things. So it was, what's funny is if I had to write I've thought about this, if I had to write the book over again today, I would have made it even more experiential, because I think so much of it was about kind of what I was seeing and living and people that I knew. And there was also this, really strong overlap with the people who I was interacting with through my work as a business journalist. Because, I mean, if there are a lot of former athletes who work on Wall Street. There are a lot of also like endurance athletes, marathoners, triathletes, et cetera. There's definitely a Venn diagram that's almost a circle of like high achievers who, run marathons and do all the endurance stuff.
My parents were in the triathlon like cruise when I was growing
Yeah.
up.
It's funny. I'm in it a lot less now. Maybe I'm a bit of a cliche, but it's like I play more golf now. In part because I can play with my sons, and like it's a whole new thing. Like,
Yeah.
and part of it is like I was looking for a new challenge, and I wanted to do something, and now I'm like that guy who's like talking about golf all the time, which maybe I don't love. But I do remember, it's like my running group and my running team, and and your schedule. I mean, I remember just getting up. I mean, my wife would wince at this, like, getting up at like 4:45, 5 in the morning to like get in 10 miles before work. Because like I had a marathon and like I really wanted to qualify for Boston. And it was just, I cared so much about what I ate. I cared so much about like, alcohol and, all of these things that were just, it was so much of who I was. And I certainly wasn't alone.
Were you able to pinpoint when the shift kind of happened?
Mhm. One of the big moments was I remember in the 80s living in Atlanta and watching my mom like work out to the Jane Fonda like VHS tapes. And so that was sort of the front end of it. And I think that as we got into the like mid to late 90s was really when it started to sort of become more and more of the lifestyle. I think baby boomers had something to do with it. But then, I'm Gen X, and I think it was my generation that, coming into the, again, late 90s, early 2000s, like started to run more. And then the next level up was really that boutique fitness craze. And, Soul Cycle was such a moment. And one of the things I write about in that book is that I took from an investor friend of mine in Atlanta, was this notion of like cheeseburgers and cupcakes, and that neither of which is especially healthy, which makes it an even funnier fitness metaphor. But the like cupcake, I mean, remember when like cupcakes were all the craze in New York City? It's like Magnolia and sprinkles and all these different things. Like cupcakes were sort of a fad. Like it was like cupcakes. My friend Alan Taylor, who came up with this, like he would tell you that like with everything, like cheeseburgers are actually eternal. So like yoga is a cheeseburger. Like people have done yoga literally for thousands of years. It sort of got big in, 60s and 70s. And it's still like steady state. Running is a cheeseburger. Cycling is a cheeseburger.
I love this analogy.
Yeah, it's good.
Soul Cycle cupcake.
Soul Cycle is a cupcake. And like, remember Flywheel? Bar, I think, is a little bit of a cupcake. Like you can pretty easily like separate them out. And so I like that. I mean, that idea feels enduring to me. I mean, Peloton's, I think, a fascinating case study. I didn't write about it a lot in the book because, and this is funny, I don't think I've ever really talked about this. See, you got me.
Yeah,
you got me
good.
on it. Yeah. I intentionally didn't write about Peloton. So that book came out in 2016. I intentionally didn't write about it because I was like, this is not going to work. I was like, this doesn't make sense. People aren't going to work out in their home. Like, that's dumb. I was dead wrong. And then I was kind of right. Like, I mean, depending on how you look, like if you look at
it was like COVID.
Right,
and then,
exactly. If you look at the stock chart, I was dead wrong and then I was right.
Yeah.
Having said that, I still have my Peloton, like in my basement. I am pretty, I'm pretty loyal to it. I use the exercises and things like that. So I'm the jury's probably a little bit out on that.
I am still curious about it. It's funny. I love Peloton. I remember during COVID, I bought one of the bikes for my family. I spent like all my money on a bike because I was like, I'm going to be the chief like officer of working out in this house, and we are all going to be fit. We're staying fit together as we're locked in, locked in this house in Connecticut. I recently have leaned into at-home workouts, and I've been like loving apps and being able to like not waste my money on a boutique workout at like spending $40 on a class and to have an app that I can just do. I actually have been really enjoying, which is kind of interesting because I was never one of those people.
And I do think, sorry, just last thought on that. Like, I think that's one area where I feel like AI may actually be helpful. Something smart enough that this probably exists and somebody's going to like send it to us after this airs. But like something that like can take my data and be like, okay, not just like, oh, take it a little easier today, but like do this workout, and like based on like what you've done over the past 5 days, like maybe don't go for a run, maybe lift some weights.
Like
and I have
hyper tailored to you.
Yes. And I do think, and I guess what I wrestle with when it comes to fitness is, and I believed in it when I wrote the book and I still believe in it. Part of what makes people spend $35, $40, $50 to go to a class is like they want to be with other people who are like their people. And millionth person to say that, fitness boutiques are the new bars, but go where everybody knows your name.
The workout classes that I'll do are I mostly do them to have a social experience with my friends. Like I have a Wednesday night class that we go to when we have a group chat, and if we're all down to go, we go. And it's awesome. Good way to see your friends, do something healthy.
Right.
shared
Exactly.
experience.
Get a protein shake afterwards
Yeah,
instead of like a
exactly.
Manhattan. Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
And I do think with AI, our experiences, even, I was talking about this again with Alex Lieberman the other day, who's the morning brew guy. And he was saying, what if you could get a newsletter, kind of like the presidential briefing,
Yes.
that was tailored to you every single morning, sent right to your email. And
Right.
now you're having this like hyper personalized experience. And I think we're going to get to that with
Yeah.
everything that we do. Well, you've had an incredible career. You have talked to so many fascinating people. I'm curious, what is one story that, kind of lives rent free in your head that's your favorite interviewer story that you've ever told or covered?
One that I remember. So same series that I first met Alex on was Athlete Empire. And I did we did an episode about Steve Young, who I had met like very briefly and, obviously had like really admired as a kid growing up and had also followed the fact like he's a legitimate private equity investor, like started a like real private equity firm. And so there's this great moment that I'll never forget, where again, going back to the idea that like we love to go for a drive with somebody. So we set it up so that we were at meeting at his office, and then we were going to drive down to Levi's Stadium where the 49ers play and like walk on the field with him and his colleague Junior Bryant, who had played at Notre Dame and then played with him at the 49ers. And so we're going to talk about like, this intersection of business and sports. And and so we, unbeknownst to me, the crew went and like set up the car, and we go out. And so they're filming us. We walk out of the car and we go to Steve Young's minivan, and like we get in the minivan and he looks in and I was like, I was like, I love a minivan. This is a great ride. And he's like, listen, if you have a bunch of kids and you don't have a minivan, you're an idiot. And it was just like an amazing moment where I was like, oh my God, Steve, like this is so cool. Like, I don't know why that one just like lives with me.
Because it's so real.
It was so real. And so that was one fun thing where I was like, I can't believe Steve Young and I are talking about minivans. Anyway, so
I always joke, by the way, I always joke with Jeremy, my fiance, that a minivan is the next best thing to a black SUV.
Oh,
Minivans
are the best. Like when we had to, like, our minivan just like died a year or so ago, and we, going back to one of our shared subjects, we took that to so many lacrosse tournaments over the years that we literally just called it the Laxmobile. And when my lacrosse player son, like when we had to retire it, he was like, rest in power, Laxmobile. I mean, it was just like, it was so good to us. It's like a Honda Odyssey that had God knows how many miles on it, and probably, ended up in a junkyard somewhere just based on like the lacrosse equipment in the back probably ruined it forever. But in any case, so minivans forever. I mean, the deal story, there have been some really fun moments on that show. I mean, the Serena one was, I think, just epic because it was just such a moment. And, sitting with the two of them, I think definitely was a pinch me moment. I do think sitting with Alex and Derek Jeter and talking about their relationship and, having an open and honest conversation about their aspirations and their memories and their friendship over the years, for a kid who loves baseball, to sit with these two sort of iconic guys and just kind of chop it up was pretty wild.
Lastly, as we wrap it up, I want to ask you, after 20 plus years of reporting, what is something that you want everybody that listens to you, reads what you do, watches you, to take away from your work?
Wow. That's a really, really good question. I do think that I've been so fortunate in getting to do all of these different things, and especially doing what I'm doing now. It's like, I do appreciate that this is fun. This is fun. And I think sometimes we overthink it, and sometimes we don't stop and realize that what we're really trying to do, like in the business, especially the business that I'm in right now, it really is about connecting with people, and connecting with people is meaningful. And we don't do it enough in this like hyper click day and age. And I do think that this notion of like, be kind, have fun, it's not always that serious, enjoy what you're doing. Like, I have the great benefit of enjoying what I do all the time. And so if I had to have somebody take away, it's like, yeah, he seems to be having a good time. And I love that. Like, I love like some of my favorite moments on the deal are when, Alex and I are just like cutting up.
I love that. And you can definitely tell how much fun you guys are having through just watching you
Yeah.
do your show. I was going to say, what would be your one piece of advice for me as an aspiring journalist? But I feel like you answered it. It really is just to have fun and
Be yourself.
be yourself.
I mean, it's funny. So again, this is a little bit of a meta story, but like when I learned I was coming on the show, I did email my friend John Gray, who had been on, who I trust implicitly. And I said, any advice? And he said, be yourself, have fun. And that's like, be yourself may be actually the most like distilled down thing. And I think we just don't do that enough. Like, be who you are. Like, and it's a cliche, but it's a cliche for a reason, because if you're not who you are, like, everyone's going to see it.
Especially if you're on camera.
Especially if you're on camera. And I do think that like one of the things that Alex and I try and do is like, we are who we are. We know who each other are, and we trust each other. But the most important thing is like, we're ourselves.
Lastly, is there anything you want to shout out? Anything coming up that we can be on the lookout for, excited about?
I mean, tune into the deal. We've got some amazing episodes coming up. We have a great time wherever you get your podcasts, YouTube, Bloomberg.com. You can't escape us.